Was that Seinfeld, a show about nothing? Like, there's a lot of nothing in your spiritual journey. Welcome to the Soma podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Paul. Now that we've deconstructed our evangelical beliefs,
we're trying to find a way forward to hold on to Christian faith and community
in a post-Christian culture. So in our first episode, Mark, you and I talked about that we were both like preacher guys, pastors in ministry, church leaders, and we both left.
Right. At some point, we both left.
We both left church, essentially. I mean, maybe we've visited at different points, but we also left church behind. And we had to find out, find a new way. Like, I had to find a new way to make a living. I know you did too.
That's definitely one of the stressful parts of the transition is when you're dependent on a church for your income, and you're no longer connected to that church, then obviously you're starting afresh.
No kidding. That is a midlife crisis right there, my friend.
That's a good one, yeah.
So, I mean, it kind of makes sense. Like, you became a teacher, right? So
Well, I had to make a choice, and I did a few things. I was a chaplain for a year at Red River, which was really I wasn't very effective. I wasn't really prepared for it. I tried to start a nonprofit for a while, did a little bit of public speaking, wrote the book, went on a couple of TV shows, but none of it really amounted to anything. And so then it was, have to make a choice here. I guess I'm a teacher. And that was my thought at the time, so I signed up for education, yeah.
Well, it makes sense. You're teaching, you're communicating, you're having to find simple ways to express maybe complicated ideas. You're helping people. Like, I ended up in advertising, my friend.
That's different, yeah.
I don't know. It's convincing people to take on things they don't really want or need. Maybe there's just.
Do you really feel that way?
I'm just kidding. Yeah. No, advertisers are good people.
I found teaching when you're teaching in the church, you get a lot of, great job and people kind of affirm you. And when you're teaching in high school, it's like the bell rings and they leave, right? There is affirmation that comes in a sense, but there's also a lot of people just listening to you because they have to, which is not always the most exciting kind of teaching.
No, it was very hard for me too, obviously. I had 4 kids by the time I decided to leave ministry behind, and it was just like, what am I going to do with my life? This is crazy. There's a song, I don't know if you're into Christmas, but there's a Christmas, White Christmas, the movie White Christmas with Bing Crosby.
Right.
There's a song where he sings, what do you do with a general who stops being a general? And I remember singing around the house, like, what do you do with a pastor who stops being a pastor? Like, how do you figure that out, right? How do you transfer that skill?
Well, it's an identity change, right? And I think looking back, that's the journey that God was starting me on, was a journey of refining your identity, strengthening your identity. But initially, it feels like a big loss because you're leaving behind what you know. You're leaving behind your source of income.
I know.
You feel kind of directionless, and you also feel that God has gone silent.
Yeah, I kind of made my wife mad at me for about 6 months because she kind of begged me to get a real job. Like, when I was in the ministry, that's how she'd put it. So I finally leave the ministry, and what do I want to do? I want to become a rock star.
A rock star. That's your go-to.
Right there. She's so mad. And I think that it's exactly speaking to the point that you mentioned. It's like, it was about identity, right? Like, I had a hard time letting go. And it was almost like it was natural for me to just think, well, I'm going to pick up music again and get that was a close fit.
You need a foundation, right? And so for me, I started painting again, and I started doing all these artistic things again that I had largely let go of while I was doing the Passion of the Red Herring and the Ministry of the Red Herring. And you're right, it's all of a sudden you have all this time and brain cycles that are not doing anything. So you got to come up with a plan B, and just an ordinary job seems kind of boring.
But, it worked out for me. I joke about the advertising part, but I ended up getting into like branding and marketing and even into film and television, produced a web TV show and got into communications. So what I'm doing today. And the thing the reason I'm bringing this up is because the common, I think, thread is storytelling. Like I remember that was a huge part of what I would have done, you would have done as well, is tell stories. Right. And I found a way to do that in a sort of the regular, corporate world. But storytelling is a huge part of how human beings learn. Like our brains are wired for stories, right?
I mean, I always hear people say that, and I guess I do know that it's true, and I think I've become more aware of it. But I was always sort of driven to learn as many details about a subject that I could. So if I get interested in something, I just I just dig down and try to find out all the details. And but you're right. I think stories are not just intellectual or factual; they're emotional, and they drive us emotionally.
Oh, absolutely. It's like when we listen to a story. I mean, I think they track the brain when this happens, right? And it's like things are lighting up everywhere, and it releases this perfect chemical, sort of a perfect blend of like oxytocin and dopamine and all these things.
Well, stories provide meaning, and I think meaning and connection are things that we're all looking for.
Yeah.
The Bible it's full of deep, multi-layered stories that are able to connect with a human experience when we sort of grapple with them.
Well, it's how we've transmitted values, right? And we've transmitted truth from generation to generation is through stories. And you're right, they're emotional. You remember them. They stay with you, especially if you empathize with the main character, right? And you can see yourself in the story. We're here today to talk a little bit about our own personal stories, right? A little bit about that. But we want to sort of reference a common story structure. This thing is as old as Aristotle, right? It's the 3-act structure. And we also have often talked about in our own group that we've talked about in the first episode, our Soma group. We've done some studying about the hero's journey, right? Which is also a story structure.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell, the writer, he kind of popularized the idea of the hero's journey, that it's a hero with 1,000 faces. Yep. It's found in many, many cultures and places, and it's that individual who's on a spiritual journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just comes to this sort of this basic 3-act structure. The first act is a character sort of living in their ordinary world. It's just, you get a sense of like, this is sort of business as usual. And then something happens. They call it the inciting incident or the catalyst, right? And that inciting incident is basically a call on the hero or the character to like leave their world behind and go out on a adventure to like basically seek out this thing that they need or this thing that they want.
And often or sometimes it's not by choice. Their circumstances push them away from home.
Yep.
Sometimes they don't realize the fundamental shift that's happening to them.
Yeah.
But it's the first turning point.
For sure. And when they take that turning point, it moves into the second act, and that's basically conflict. It's every time that character tries to sort of apprehend or get a hold of that goal, something pushes it further.
I think that's how you know that you're on a spiritual journey, right?
Yeah.
Like we have kind of a popular idea of spiritual journey sounds very kind of wishy-washy.
Yeah.
But a part of any spiritual journey is going to be struggle, things that you have to overcome, people that are opposed to you, perhaps, obstacles that you didn't anticipate, and it's going to take some time as well. We'd like to have quick spiritual journeys, but a lot of them are slow. They take years.
Yeah.
That God leads us through this winding path that we can't anticipate, and we don't know when it's going to end. Yeah.
So what you're saying is like basically these stories. They are metaphors for life. So we actually live these hero journeys, and we can see this in our own lives. And you're saying there's a spiritual one that is being offered to people. Is that fair to say?
I just think in a very basic way that people are on a spiritual journey, whether they realize it or not.
Wow.
And it's happening to you through the circumstances of your life, through the choices that you've made, through the impact of other people's choices.
Yeah.
And you're on it whether you like it or not, really. And, I think there's spiritual pathways that are greater and some that are lesser and some that get resolved and some that don't get resolved. But the fact of the matter is, wherever you are right now, that's your part of your spiritual journey.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of the great stories, that inciting incident is like the character basically had no idea this was coming. Like the night that that Bilbo leaves the ring on Frodo's floor, right? And Frodo finds the ring. Like the minute he finds that ring, his life is screwed, right?
Or it's on a trajectory to something greater.
Yeah.
But
Good perspective.
In contrast with movies, I think a lot of times movies kind of tell it to us in a very high version of that story.
Right.
In our day-to-day
In 2
life,
hours.
it's slow. Everybody wants to save the world. Nobody wants to go to work on a Monday morning.
Yeah.
There's a lot of drag. There's a lot
Right.
of
Movie editors, they add out all the extra stuff you don't need to see. Maybe our lives are more like a television series, right? Like long season after season after season. Every episode almost has a little hero's journey, but then there's one that arcs over the season, and then there's one that can arc over the entire lifespan of the show.
Right.
And so maybe that's similar to our lives. Like maybe there are smaller versions of this, and then there are more epic, large-scale versions.
Was that Seinfeld, a show about nothing?
Yeah,
There's a lot of nothing in your
I guess
spiritual journey. I think it's worth contrasting that. So we've kind of painted a story picture of the spiritual journey in terms of a contrast to how I was taught, or at least picked up the idea of how you begin a Christian spiritual journey. And it's primarily you pray this prayer, Romans, you confess your sin, you believe believe Jesus died to save you from your sin, and then the transactions made, you kind of move from one place to another.
Yeah.
And I'm not against that, praying that prayer or being aware of that, but I've led people through that prayer and they haven't moved very far, right?
Right.
So what we're talking about is something maybe bigger and wider than that.
Yeah.
It can include that, but it's I think the idea that you simply pray a prayer and the spiritually important stuff has happened is too small a picture.
No, I agree. So I don't think I told you I was going to ask you this, Mark, but I'm actually going to ask you about your inciting incident. Like at least one you can tell me about.
Yeah, one of them, sure.
But just before you do, just for the listeners, just to complete the story structure. So Act 2 is most of the story. It's a long section of the story, and it's conflict and it's rising tensions.
All the problems.
Yeah, and usually you meet along the way like your comrades who help you, and you meet a guide actually who mentors you. But it's just one issue after another until finally you reach this sort of moment where it's like all is lost, like all the villains have gathered round, there's no hope, and they call that moment in the story the second turning point. So if inciting incident was point number one, the second point is this dark night of the soul,
right?
Or they call it the belly of the whale, which are both biblical references.
Exactly. And so the point where basically all seems lost,
right?
And your resources and your abilities are not enough to get that turning point. So you need something to come from the outside. Yeah. And that's, in a sense, that's a picture, I think, of the resurrection.
Yeah.
When Jesus dies, that's his dark night, but he's going to get brought back up and come to life.
And he literally says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So it's like the loss or death of God for him. And I think I can relate to that. And maybe I think you can and others can in different ways. After that dark night of the soul, you're right. That's the shift into Act 3. And the hero digs deep. And there's a final sort of conflict and clash. And the hero triumphs. And usually the hero then changes. Like through the whole process, there's been a transformation. Right. And that's kind of like where the whole thing's going.
So I guess to answer your question, I would say one of the biggest turning points in my life was meeting my wife at university. And I was on kind of a spiritual search up to that point through meditation, lucid dreaming, lots of various occult interests and reading and so forth. And then when I met Alex, we began a conversation about her faith, and she challenged me in some ways. And as part of that challenge, I eventually picked up the Bible, and I started reading some of the Bible. And I realized it was 180 degree from what I actually thought was going on.
Like, do you remember, like, what you felt like when you say 180 degrees? Like, that's curious to me. Like, so like now you know the Bible really well. You studied it. How was it different for that first few times?
For me, my experience reading the Bible felt like To use a cliche, it did feel like a revelation. It felt so different than I thought it would be. And I remember praying, and I was asking God, if this is real, you got to show me. And it was doing something in me. And in the middle of it was a season that was sort of happening. I was living in Vancouver, and I had a kind of vision, I'll call it a vision, in which I saw myself in a log cabin, and I was kind of messing about with all this like technology stuff that was kind of not going anywhere. It was all melting in my hands. And then I had this realization that at the back of the log cabin was Jesus, and I thought he might come and knock on the door, and I was worried about that. So I went outside, and when I went outside, I saw this sort of light in the sky, and I saw Alex was dressed in white on the sand dunes, and I heard a voice, and the voice said, history is divided up between two groups of people, and you need to decide which group you want to belong to.
Wow.
And I immediately came out of it, and it threw me for a loop because it felt so real, and I knew that God had spoken to me.
Wow.
And I knew enough to just pray and ask God for help, and that was sort of like the watershed moment. There was a process of growing faith and trying to understand what had happened to me that was sort of centered around that.
So this happened to you, like, did you have any like grid for this? Like, had you been to church, or was this just all happening just in your apartment?
I mean, like I said, I was always interested in spiritual things from a young age. 15 years old, and I was in my bedroom trying to meditate, and I would practice lucid dreaming, which is where you realize you're dreaming.
At 15?
I was always interested. I started a ghost club when I was 12. And I just was interested in the supernatural and paranormal. So I had that kind of a mindset. And I did go to church occasionally as a kid. I was infant baptized by my parents, but I had no knowledge of Scripture and no other than a very general awareness, I guess. So that the light kind of turned on, and I just started reading, and I was fascinated, and I wanted to know more.
Wow! So that was one of your main inciting incidents of your life.
It was without that turning point in my life, I think that I would be in a totally different place. Yeah.
So something happened to me too. Something I look back at now. That's kind of what I wanted us to maybe touch on today a little bit too. Is I don't know if we're in Act 2 or Act 3 of our lives. Hopefully, we're not.
I think I'm starting Act 3.
Really?
Yeah.
With that Act 3 perspective, I'm interested to sort of see what you think, like looking back at that inciting incident, sort of how you interpret that. But I want to do that too. And for me, something actually really happened to me and my family. It was like, when you talk about a conversion experience, we had a conversion experience, like the kind you read about, like, say, somebody like Saul in the book of Acts of the Bible, who on one day he's literally persecuting Christians and getting them killed, right? Like through stoning and stuff. And then like on another day, he's the biggest proponent of Christianity that we've ever seen. And the difference was a experience that he claimed to have had with the risen Christ, right? That knocked him off a horse and he got blind.
Right, he heard a sound, or the people that were with him, they heard something, but they didn't really know what was happening, right?
Yeah. So like you can say, okay, maybe he's crazy. Maybe he made all that up. Maybe something weird goes on there. Maybe he has psychological problems. I don't know. However you explain that away, it did change the course of his life. And that's kind of what I hear from you too. Like, you see this vision, you see Jesus in a cabin, you see a light, and like you can explain it all you want, but from your own sort of lips, like this thing, whatever it was, it changed the course of your life.
Yeah, I mean, from the outside, it didn't look like anything, and I had zero interest in becoming a Christian, and I just even for the first year, it was challenging. Like, I remember telling one of my good friends at the time I'd become a Christian, and my parents, and they were all stunned. It was like, what are you talking about? You don't realize what's happening when it's happening, right? And it sounds like a quick process, but it's a drawn out process that's happening in various stages.
Well, for me, so I was 12 years old, and I didn't grow up religious at all. Like we would have said, we're Catholic because we're Portuguese, but never been to church, never been to mass. I didn't even know Jesus rose from the dead, like all the classic sort of Christian ideas. I had no idea that people believed he was coming back again. This was all news to me. I had no experience with God. And my family life wasn't happy at the time. So like my dad was a really angry guy. He had a lot of sort of trouble from his childhood, just a really angry, abusive sort of father. And I remember just being afraid of my dad. He just seemed like he would fly off the handle anytime, you kind of approached him with something
Right.
that he wasn't, expecting. And then my mom, I just remember her being just super depressed and always sort of afraid. She was always at home because she was scared. She had phobias about leaving the house. And she was really sick physically. She went to doctors and they said it was psychosomatic because they couldn't find anything wrong with her. And I didn't know at the time, but I had hints of this, but they told me afterwards that they were basically on the verge of divorce at that time. And then one day, inciting incident comes along. My mom is just flipping through the channels of the television set, and she catches like a TV evangelist, and she starts to listen to this person, and she begins to like cry, and like something begins to move her, and she begins to like call out and pray to Jesus. We had never again been to church, and so none of this happened in a church. This happened just in our house. I used to say like God came and made a house call,
Right.
and the next thing you know, my mom is like leaving the house all the time because she's going to like prayer groups and Bible studies, and she's like not sick, like she's waking up every morning fine.
So something has changed.
Something has changed in her, and my dad didn't like it. And I kind of watched him because a 12-year-old son, you're kind of watching your dad to be the example. And he's like, your mom's going crazy. I'm going to have to talk to her. And so he talked to her and he actually put an ultimatum in front of her. And he said, it's either me or Jesus, but I'm not going to take you. You're a fanatic. I don't, this is not what I want with our life. Our marriage is already on the rocks. And my mom, and he thought my mom would just cave because she would, he would be used to putting sort of his foot down and she would do that. And she looked at him and she had this like strength and resolve he had never seen. And she said, I love you, but I love Jesus more. I will not abandon Jesus. So if you're going to leave, leave. And he was like completely shook and like to the core. He didn't leave. He started to pick up the Bible behind her back and just read it to see what she was getting into. Kind of like what you said, like just
I think relationships. You get the clearest picture of Jesus, I think, often through people.
Yeah.
People who are trying their best to make a decision or a choice based on their understanding of who Jesus is.
Well, it had an
initial
impact.
Steps,
It had an impact on my dad, and maybe a few weeks later, I was in bed going to sleep, and all of a sudden, my dad calls down to me, Paul, come down, quick, come down. And I run down the stairs, and I run into the living room, and he's sitting there with a Bible on his lap, and he's got tears just streaming down his face, and he's speaking in a language I've never heard before. And I'm like, Dad,
it's a little odd.
Like it doesn't sound like Portuguese. He says, son, I was just reading here about these people who are filled with the Holy Spirit, and they started to speak in this language, and I just asked God, could I speak in this language? And this is what started to happen. And I'm like, holy mackerel, like, what is this? And then I found out that my dad had just recently had a nightmare, and he woke up from the nightmare, and he just turned to my mom, and he woke her out of her sleep, and he was just crying like a baby and just saying, I want your Jesus. I want what you have. And he gave his life to Jesus. So Mark, like all this was happening in our house, never been to a church. I never heard of the sinner's prayer. I've never heard of a hymn, never sang a song, never heard a preacher. This happened over a period of a few months. And when this happened to my parents, and I noticed my dad really changed, like he started to be really soft. He forgave his father. He was crying all the time. He bought this guitar, and he learned 2 chords, A minor and E minor, and he would play that. We'd put the dishes away after supper every night, and he'd just play those 2 chords, A minor, E minor, A minor, E minor.
I even know those chords.
You even know those chords. And we sang to those two chords for like hours, just our own lyrics, just made it up, just crying and praying and singing. And none of this happened in a church. It was just there in our house, and it made a difference. And it changed my life. It was a very powerful experience. It set me on this course to like follow Christianity, follow Christ, and end up giving my life to it. And when I look back at that, the seeds of it were really kind of, I think they've stayed with me. Like, it was like very experiential.
Right.
It was very simple in the reading of, like, my dad's like, it says here that they did this, so I asked God to give it to me. Like, it was sort of a simple reading of Scripture, and it was really home and family based and relationship based. And I think I've never really shook that off. Like, that's always stuck with me.
It makes sense to me that God would do something in your family. He just wanted to change something, and he used your mom to get it going.
Yeah.
And I look at your family, and I see, I mean, I'm looking from the outside, but I see that there's a lot of good there, and that comes from, you don't seem angry.
No.
You know.
And like, it changed. Like, it's real. The fruit of it is real. So that, like, my parents are still together today, right? My dad is a very soft-hearted man. You know, it's impacted my life. It's impacted my children's life. My mother is a solid sort of rock of a person. Like, you know, now that I've gone through Act 2 and I've gone through the death of God, you know, my God, where are you? There'd be times where I would look back at that inciting incident for me and go, like, what happened there? Like, if there's no God, then how do I explain that? And you know what, Mark, if it was a fiction, it certainly was a very useful and powerful one. It saved my parents' marriage, and it set my whole life on a path that has been very fruitful and meaningful. So that is just, yeah, that's, how do you, I guess, what do you say to that? Like, what do you say?
I just think that's normal spiritual stories they involve the family. They involve identity change, that, you know, your dad started off one way and then he became a different way. And he probably, you know, in the moment something happened, but he probably still had to work it out. There were probably times when he still got angry.
Yeah.
There were probably things he had to forgive himself. Maybe your mother had to forgive him. Maybe you had to forgive him. All of that stuff takes time to work out. I've spent a good portion of my life working out things that happened in my family. You know, my parents emigrated to Canada, which was also a huge impacting event on my life, and devastated our family for in many ways. We've all recovered and worked through some of the losses that happened from moving from England to Canada, but it deeply affected my parents' marriage. It affected my relationship with my father, which in fact affected my relationship with my kids. And so all of that is the obstacles, right? Every spiritual story has a series of obstacles, and they're relational obstacles, they're internal obstacles that you have to work out, you know. And it's a journey where you're moving from one identity, the old you, to who God, I think, is calling you to be. And that's, in a sense, that's a picture of leaving home as a metaphor. You're leaving one version of yourself, or maybe who you could have been, and God's guiding you to the version that He wants you to be, that He's created you to be. So all of those stories, like Bilbo leaving home, you know, even the disciples, you know, Jesus says, you know, come follow me, which implies a leaving. You know, leave your old life, leave your old job as a fisherman, leave your old life as a, you know, a tax collector or whatever it is. That the spiritual invitation is an invitation to leave some identity that you have had. So it's not surprising to me looking back. You know, we both have gone through a death process where we left our Christian identities behind, and that's even a God thing too, right? That's surprising because we think, well, once you're a Christian, you've kind of got it. But I think that God intentionally leads you through a death process so that you can experience the new identity.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's like the inciting incident of our lives made us Christians, and it ultimately brought us into serving the church and serving God through formal ministry, only for the journey to then lead us right back out of that service, and even right back out of our Christian identity, right? And experiencing a death of sorts. I'm still processing this. I don't know if I'm in Act 2 or Act 3, but I feel lately I want God. Like, even if it's just my brain telling me, feel God right now, play a song and release all these hormones, even if my brain is making God real, I don't want to live in a universe without feeling God close.
It's interesting that you emphasize the feeling component. I like from what I know of you, and even just some of your background, that you kind of had that Pentecostal influence. Mm-hmm. You're probably. I struggle with some of the feeling aspects of it sometimes, and I think that you're probably better at that. What's worked for me is seeing the pattern, and so again, to reference the matrix, there's the when you see those little glitches, when you see those things that make you realize something is going on, and that's how I feel about God. I feel I'm using the feel world, is that God has shown me that the story is a living story that's happening to everybody, and you can be further away from God, and you can be closer to God, and you can have more understanding. You can miss some of those key plot points. You're going to have the spiritual experience, whether you realize it or not. And I think I told you this story off when we were talking earlier about when my daughter was going through a tough time. She was studying to be a lab tech, and it's a very demanding course, and she was extremely overwhelmed at one point. She was studying like hours and hours a day. And I was worried about her because she was studying so hard and just nothing else, And I had the picture of, so there's the picture of Jesus falls asleep in the boat, and the disciples get upset that there's a storm, and they're freaking out. There's a storm. Why isn't Jesus awake? And eventually Jesus does wake up, and he does calm the storm. And it made me realize that you're going to experience the storm, but if you don't understand how the story works, you don't understand where Jesus is. Jesus is there. He is present. He's making a point. You can't access him in the story. So you need that knowledge as well as the experience. And many people have the experience and lack the knowledge that gives the meaning to the story.
No, that's super interesting. I think maybe that's part of what maybe this podcast is about. Maybe we can help ourselves and anyone who's listening that finds this useful to see the patterns, maybe to learn some of the meanings of the stories, have like language and reference points. So one thing, I think we're probably got to wrap up soon, but one thing I was thinking about was the difference for me. I think the times where I felt a connection with God and the times that I didn't was the times that I did was because I was actually just looking for it, right? I think our brains have evolved in such a way where it literally has to decide what information is important, right? Like we're bombarded with probably millions.
We're overwhelmed. We have so much information
for sure, and I think our brains can only focus on 50 to 100 things instead of the 2 million things that bombard us, and so we. You ever have that experience? I think you have, because you're a car guy, I think. So when you look for a car and you're looking at a specific make and model.
You see it everywhere.
Now all of a sudden that you're paying attention to, you see it everywhere, right?
Absolutely.
I think it's that way with God. Like, I think when I went for those years, just quite happy to be without, like, I lived a happy life without God, and I didn't see God very much, right? But then, like, now that I'm actually trying to look for him again, I'm seeing it, right? I'm finding it. I'm seeing the patterns, or I'm noticing the signs, so is it our brain? Is it just that, like, Jesus is always in the boat, like you said,
right?
But just our brains don't, they kind of edit it out until it maybe makes sense.
Well, I think God, he does tell us to seek him, and that the seeking does work.
Yeah.
And absolutely. I told my son this recently. I said, just pray every day and ask God to show you what to do. give him some time to do it, because it takes time. He doesn't always answer immediately, and there'll be, a process of hearing that takes time.
Yeah.
But I honestly do believe, and that's the one practice I've never given up, even when I felt like giving up my faith, is I'll still pray, because it does work.
Wow.
And sometimes it's all you've got. It's that the little thread that you keep pulling on, and it's a practice that just, for me, has pulled me through some dark nights, and I would never give it up, because
Wow.
it's made all the difference in the end.
Well, there you go, folks. I guess if we could end on something, there's a lot of verses that say basically ask, seek, knock, wait. It seems like God isn't super obvious in this world or in this story, but if we actually take some time to say things like, my dad said when he was reading the Bible, like, could I have this? He asked. And when you read the Bible and that inciting incident for you, you were like, show me if this is true, if this is real.
Right.
You asked.
Yeah, asking God questions is a great way to learn something. But give God time to answer. That's. I find there's a bit of a delay. At least that's how it's worked in my life. But just be open to seeking, and recognize the circumstances. It's probably not a surprise that so many people go through a crisis in their life, because often the crisis is part of the necessary breakup of our old systems and ways of coping that's needed to take us somewhere new. And so there's all kinds of crises that come in our life. I don't think it always has to be that way, but I've noticed that it often is. And so when you're in the middle of it, it can be really challenging. But that's the time to start digging and start asking those questions and start seeking. I would want to encourage people to realize that you're having a spiritual story, and it's bigger than just pray this prayer and hopefully get into heaven at the end of all this. Mm-hmm. It's that Jesus is able to give resources and insight through the stories of Scripture, but also through the way He speaks. And I think how does God speak is probably a whole other episode as well, and we probably have different takes on it.
Yeah.
And because to some degree it's individual, but if you are on a spiritual journey, it makes sense to get some help with where you're going.
Yeah. So you know what? Tell us about your inciting incident. We'd love to hear from you. We leave an email and other contact information in the show notes of the episode. And we'd love to hear about your inciting incident of your story. Okay, that's it for another episode.